Cel shading is a hard block of color rather than something blended for shadow. Cel shading is mostly used in animation because it's easier. It was coined by animation actually because we call that celled. Your animation cells were on flat pieces of like clear plastic, and painting each of those in, that's one cell. So you would animate those and you would paint them with like acrylic or gouache, and those would be, each frame of animation would be a cell. That's where the term was coined, because obviously you're not gonna blend in each cell, you're gonna make that shadow just one strip of color with the acrylics. So that's why it's called cel shading. Where to place your cel shadows. Here's the fun thing, right? There's really no difference between where to place cel shadows and where to place normal shadows, because all that cel shading is just like a condensed version of normal shading. So let me show you an example of that really quickly. So cel shading are these hard edge shadows. Notice that there's no blending whatsoever, right? It's just one giant block. There's corn again. There's just one giant block of color, right, for each shadow that's present, right? Even the highlights, just one strip of color. There really isn't anything blended. It's all just one big block. That's what cel shading is. So we could blend them in. That's soft shading. If we don't blend it in, that's called cel shading. So you have a bit of a hard edge right there. So placing cel shadows is the same as any other shadow, but now it won't be as soft and there's no need to worry about blending. It works the other way around, right? People are like, I know how to cel shade. I don't know how to soft shade. I know how to soft shade. I don't know how to cel shade. They are exactly the same. The only difference is now you're working with different shapes. You're working with different techniques. So instead, let me tell you some things to keep in mind when you're shading with cels, which can also be applied to regular like soft shading as well. So keep in mind, shadows are a shape, not a line. If we have, so let's say that we've got like our light source coming from up here. The biggest mistake that I will always see, the biggest mistake, is if people do this kind of magic, right? They're like, oh, there's a sleeve here. I'm just gonna draw the shadow like this. And then there's like an edge here, so I'm gonna draw it like this. And there's an edge here, so I'm gonna draw it like this, right? We're not doing it this way, right? Shadows are a shape, not a line. They are gonna follow whatever shape the object is presenting here, right? Especially if this light source is farther away. So if it's coming from the top up here, there's gonna be light hitting this side and shadow hitting this side. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna follow the shape of the sleeve. I'm also gonna track where my folds are, and I'm gonna fill it in that way. There's more folds on this side, so I'm gonna fill it in over here as well. This part of the arm blocks off this shadow. Same thing with this fold here, and as we get farther down, now there's gonna be light hitting here on top. So instead, we're gonna have our shadow coming underneath here, and then there's gonna be some on the other side of these fingers, and then maybe there's even more shadow on just this half of the body, like there's just nothing there. Inside of the hood, and maybe a little bit on this side of the hood as well, depending on how intense this side shadow thing is. Right? Shadow is a shape, not a line, right? It is a shape. You need to make sure that it follows the shape of the form that blocks the light source. We never want to make it just this line. We want to make sure that it is this big shape, right? We need to understand where the light is hitting. Physically tell yourself, okay, if the light is coming from here, where is it going to hit? And by comparison, where on the other side of the body is it not going to hit? If we have it hitting on one side, it will not hit on the other. So we got to understand where it will hit and where it will not hit, right? That is the biggest thing when it comes to shadows. That's the only thing you need to understand. You need to think logically with where our light source is coming from and where it will stay. As long as you just establish one from the beginning, everything else is easy to fill in, because all you need to think is logically, okay, something here is blocking the light, it has to cast a shadow. Oh, this thing is translucent, the light will pass through it a little, but it will be colored because of its translucency, or it won't go through all the way, right? Oh, it's very close to the light source, so on and so forth. Proximity and size will change the shadow's size, length, and need. One really, really big mistake that I see a lot is like, if we have some things that will like cause shadow, is that everything will have the exact same size of shadow. So let's say that we've got a bunch of little cubes here. There's one tall one teeny tiny thin one right here, and then we've got kind of a moderately sized one right here as well. Let's say that we've got a bunch of boxes that are this size. right? The biggest mistake that I will always see is that people will be like, oh, light source coming from up here. So that means all my shadows will be just like this. This is wrong, actually. That's not correct. Not even close. So when we have our shadows, there's height difference. There's difference in these objects. There's difference in these shapes. Based on what we're looking at, these shadows' heights, sizes will change. They will not all go to the exact same length. They all have different height. Maybe if one is translucent, it might not even cast the same type of shadow, right? So let's say that we put that light source back. Let's say we have right over here again. This one is the tallest one. We have the tallest shadow right here. So it is gonna cast the biggest shadow. Maybe it's gonna be super, super long. Maybe it's gonna be still pretty short. It depends on the time of day. Who knows? This one is gonna be the second tallest, but it's not gonna be as tall as this one because it's a much shorter object. And by comparison, this little boy right here is gonna be the smallest little shadow. Might not even come up to the other ones because of how short it is. This is far more correct, right? Your heights of your shadows, the sizes of your shadows will change. Proximity and size will change shadow length, size, and need. Proximity. These two objects are close to each other, so it will cast a little shadow right here. If this, like, let's say that this little tile was over here, there would be no shadow cast against here. These two are pretty close to each other, so there's shadows on either side. If they were farther away, they might have no shadow, just like this. If I was teaching about softer shading, I would also say that the shadow would get blurrier the farther away you get, but this is cel shading. No need to worry about that. They're all blocks, doesn't matter. So proximity and size will change the shadow length, size, and need. The need for a shadow. Some things are so small, so tiny, that there is no need to fill in a shadow. You know, cel shading is a simplification of shadow in itself, right? I saw one artist, one of my students, what they did is they had like somebody who was a robot and they had like a piece of armor plating on the head, kind of like this. And then they decided to cast a shadow back here. No need. If that plate is directly on the skull, there is no need because it is flesh with the skull. Maybe it's up a little bit. Maybe there's a little bit of like height by comparison to the skull, but there is no need to add a shadow there at all because of how, like, you know, small that edge is, right? So proximity and size will change the shadow length, size, and need. If you'd like to support the channel and the creation of free arts education, become a member on Patreon for working files, behind-the-scenes posts, and discounts on our class offerings. So Bounce and Subsurface can also be cells and it still looks good. You can also add an occlusion shadow. So if you don't know, Bounce Light, it's the extra light source that you might have. Subsurface scattering on translucent objects such as skin. It's that little red edge. And occlusion shadows are the darkest points of your shadow. The occlusion shadow is the shadow that is there because of proximity, no matter what. Let's say that this is a skin sphere. And let's say that we wanted to add a bit of ambient occlusion or a little bit of subsurface scattering. So we add a little bit of orange to the edge of that shadow. And then there's a little bit of bounce light going on too, so we pop that back in there too. Right? This looks fine. Looks great. This is soft blended with cel shading. Looks totally fine. Looks great. But let's say we wanted to add this back in, right? If we still wanted our, like, you know, subsurface scattering, we just added a little edge like this. And then we also wanted our bounce light, which was just a little line like this. Both of these are fine. Bounce Subsurface can also be celled and it still looks good. You can also add a core shadow. So yes, also yes, both of these, totally fine. You can even do this fun little technique that digital artists do, which is adding in a core shadow, which is the dark little section, which, by the way, is still accurate. Like, it is perfectly fine to do this as well. Some people choose between either subsurface or the core shadow. And then if I was to kind of add this back in like that. So it really depends on what you're doing. This one has the core shadow and bounce. This one has subsurface and bounce. It keeps all of the principles of shadow and lighting and all that. But now the technique has changed, but it is exactly the same with each one. There is no difference. We love art nerds at Wing Canvas, and these videos exist because of our awesome community. Is there a topic you want to see us make a video about? Let us know in the comments below.
Join a virtual class to learn live from our professional artists. Get creative assignments, individual guidance, and real-time feedback on your artwork. Start today and level up your practice. If you learned something new, like and share this with a fellow art nerd. Here's a couple other videos you can check out next.